The sirens of Station 14 were still echoing in Sandra Thomas's ears as she scrubbed the stubborn soot from her forearms. The smell of charred timber and diesel clinging to her skin like a second shadow. At 28 years old, Sandra Thomas was one of the most respected firefighters in the city, known for a grit that surpassed her physical stature and a heart that didn't know how to quit even when the temperature hit flashpoint. It had been a grueling 48-hour shift, culminating in a stubborn basement fire at a luxury high owned by Carter Industries, a situation made worse by the building's owner Brandon Carter, who had insisted on arguing with Sandra Thomas about the structural integrity of his precious marble foyer while she was trying to save the floors above it. Brandon Carter, a 34-year-old billionaire with a jawline as sharp as his business tactics and a reputation for treating the world like his personal chessboard, had not taken kindly to being told to shut up and move behind the yellow tape by a woman covered in ash. He was a man who measured worth in net profit and social influence, and Sandra Thomas' blunt authority had bruised an ego that had never known a scratch. As Sandra Thomas gathered her gear to head home, the station's front desk officer handed her a heavy, cream-colored envelope that looked entirely out of place against the industrial backdrop of the firehouse. The paper was thick, textured with a subtle linen weave, and sealed with a wax stamp bearing the Carter crest. An ostentatious display of wealth that made Sandra Thomas' tired eyes narrow in suspicion. Inside the envelope was a card embossed with gold leaf inviting Captain Sandra Thomas to the Carter Emerald Gala, the most exclusive black tie event of the season, where the City-S elite gathered to bid on rare art and solidify their positions in the social hierarchy. Brandon Carter hadn't sent the invitation out of a sudden appreciation for public service. He sent it because he had spent the last 3 weeks obsessing over the way Sandra Thomas had dismissed him in front of his board members during that fire. He wanted to see her out of her element, stripped of her heavy turnout gear and her fire axe, standing among the titans of industry where she would surely look like a common pebble among diamonds. He planned to use the gala as a stage to subtly remind her that, while she might control a fire, he controlled the city, and he intended to enjoy the sight of her stumbling through the complex etiquette of the old. When Sandra Thomas arrived at her modest apartment on the outskirts of the city, her roommate and best friend, Melissa Robinson, a 30-year-old nurse who had seen the best and worst of humanity alongside her, snatched the invitation with a gasp of disbelief. Melissa Robinson knew immediately that this was a setup, a cruel game played by a man who had too much time and too little empathy. Yet she saw an opportunity that Sandra Thomas was too exhausted to consider. She looked at Sandra Thomas, who was currently wearing an oversized station t-shirt and gray sweatpants, her hair tied in a messy knot, and told her that if she didn't go, Brandon Carter would win the silent war he had started. Sandra Thomas initially laughed at the idea, pointing out that her gala attire consisted of a single navy blue suit she used for promotional ceremonies, and that the cost of a seat at that dinner was likely more than her annual mortgage payments. But the more she thought about the way Brandon Carter had looked at her at the scene with a condescending smirk that suggested she was nothing more than a necessary nuisance, more a familiar fire began to burn in her chest. It wasn't just about her own pride. It was about every person who worked a manual job, every first responder who was treated like the help by people who lived in glass towers. Brandon Carter thought he could buy her silence or her discomfort, but he didn't realize that Sandra Thomas had spent her life walking into buildings that everyone else was running out of, and a room full of arrogant billionaires was nothing compared to a back. As the week progressed, the psychological weight of the invitation began to settle over her, and she realized that if she attended, she would have to do it in a way that left no room for Brandon Carter's planned mockery. She began to look through her late father's old belongings, searching for something that could ground her. Eventually finding his vintage mechanical watch, a relic from his own 30-year career in the fire service. It was a beautiful piece, but it was broken. A symbol of a legacy that she carried every day in her blood, but didn't know how to display in a ballroom. Brandon Carter, meanwhile, was already briefing his social circle on the special guests he had invited, preparing a series of backhanded compliments and public toasts designed to highlight Sandra Thomas' lack of pedigree. He was so certain of his victory that he did even consider the possibility that the woman who fought fires for a living might be the one to burn his reputation to the ground. Sandra. Thomas stood in front of her mirror looking at the invitation. One last time, her decision made, not out of vanity but out of a fierce, unyielding need to prove that dignity isn't something you can print on a gold-embossed card. The week leading up to the Emerald Gala felt like a slow-motion descent into a different kind of fire for Sandra Thomas. One that didn't burn the skin but scorched the spirit with the cold heat of social anxiety. She spent her off hours staring at her father's broken watch, the ticking heart of a man who had given everything to a city that now seemed to prefer the glitter of Brandon Carter as towers over the grit of its protectors. To secure the funds for her transformation, Sandra Thomas made the heart-wrenching trek to a high-end horologist in the Diamond District. a small shop tucked away from the neon glare where the air smelled of ozone and ancient oil. The watchmaker, a silver-haired man named Justin Baker, who had seen 1,000 legacies pass through his magnifying loupe, gasped when he saw the movement of the timepiece. He informed her that while the crystal was shattered and the gears were seized, the watch was a rare 1964 Omega SPG Master, a piece of history that, even in its state, could command a price of nearly $4,000. Sandra Thomas didn't want to sell her father's soul, but Justin Baker offered her a different path, a high-interest loan against the watch, giving her $2,000 to play the part while he worked to restore the piece to its former glory. With the cash tucked into her pocket, Sandra Thomas felt a heavy mixture of guilt and resolve as she walked toward Madison Avenue. Entering a world where a single handbag costs more than a fire engine's tire, she avoided the cold glass-fronted modern boutiques and instead found herself drawn to a vintage couture shop called the Phoenix S Nest, run by an elderly woman named Carol Moore, who had sharp eyes and hands that moved like a pianist S. Carol Moore did unlook at Sandra Thomas' worn boots, or the faint smell of smoke that always lingered in her hair. She looked at her posture, the way her shoulders stayed level and her gaze remained unbroken. When Sandra Thomas explained she needed something for a gala hosted by Brandon Carter Carroll, Moore's expression curdled with a knowing distaste, revealing that Brandon Carter had once tried to buy the building her shop sat in just to turn it into a parking garage for his executors. Carol Moore led her to the back of the store, bypassing the bright sequins and the fluffy tulle, and pulled out a gown that seemed to be made of liquid obsidian. It was a deep, shimmering charcoal silk that caught the light in ripples of silver and smoke, with a structured bodice that mimicked the strength of armor and a skirt that flowed like a controlled burn. It wasn't a dress for a debutante. It was a dress for a warrior. As Sandra Thomas stepped into the silk, she felt the transformation begin, the calluses on her hands a stark but beautiful contrast to the delicate fabric. Carol Moore adjusted the neckline, whispering that the dress had once belonged to a woman who had fought for the right to vote in the highest circles of power. "You don't wear this dress to fit in, honey," Carol Moore said, her voice a low rasp of encouragement. On the night of the gala, Brandon Carter stood in the center of the grand ballroom of the Plaza Hotel, a glass of vintage champagne in his hand and a circle of nodding sycophants around him. He had spent the evening subtly mocking the brave fire captain he had invited, describing her as a quaint addition to the guest list who would likely show up in a rented tuxedo or a dress that smelled of a bargain bin. He checked his watch, a diamond-encrusted monstrosity that cost $60,000, waiting for the moment Sandra Thomas would walk through the doors and realize she was a fish out of water. But when the herald announced Captain Sandra Thomas, the room didn't erupt in muffled laughter. It fell into a stunned, heavy silence. Sandra Thomas didn't walk. She marched with the rhythmic, steady pace of someone who was used to leading a crew into the mouth of hell. The charcoal silk caught the light of the massive chandeliers, making her look like she was wreathed in shadows and starlight. Her hair was swept back into a sleek, architectural bond, revealing a face that was strikingly beautiful in its fierce, unyielding symmetry. Brandon Carter's smirk didn't just fade. It disintegrated. He watched as Sandra Thomas navigated the room with a terrifying grace, her eyes scanning the crowd with the same tactical precision she used on a fire ground. She didn't look for a place to hide. She looked for the exit, the fire hazards, and the vulnerabilities of the people staring at her. The turning point came when Brandon Carter, desperate to regain his footing, approached her with a group of his most influential board members, including the formidable Elizabeth Jones. Elizabeth Jones was a 72-year-old titan of the steel industry, a woman whose family had built half the skyline and whose approval was the ultimate currency in this room. Brandon Carter leaned in, his voice dripping with a forced, oily warmth. "Captain Thomas, I'm so glad you could join us. I was just telling Elizabeth about your spirited defense of my marble foyer last month. It's fascinating to see you without the suit and the heavy boots." He expected Sandra Thomas to blush, to stammer an apology, or to look down at her feet. Instead, she turned to face him, her eyes locking onto his with a cold, blue intensity that made the billionaire take a half step back. "The smell of smoke is the smell of work," Mr. Carter Sandra Thomas said, her voice clear and resonant enough to carry to the surrounding tables. "And while marble is beautiful, it doesn't hold up a building when the structure is compromised." The board members shifted uncomfortably, but Elizabeth Jones' eyes narrowed, not in anger, but in a sudden, sharp interest. Elizabeth Jones stepped forward, her silk gown rustling like dry leaves. "That watch," Elizabeth Jones said, her voice trembling slightly. "It's a 1964 Speedmaster with a custom engraving on the case back, isn't it?" Sandra Thomas' heart hammered against her ribs as she nodded. "Explain it. It belonged to her father, Patrick Phillips." The color drained from Elizabeth Jones' face, and she reached out to touch her arm with a hand that was surprisingly steady. "Your father didn't just die in a fire," Sandra Elizabeth Jones whispered, ignoring Brandon Carter as if he were a fly on the wall. "He died in the 1996 Jones Plaza fire. He stayed behind on the 42nd floor to make sure my daughter and I reached the stairwell." The revelation rippled through the ballroom like a shockwave, stripping the gala of its pretension and replacing it with a raw, undeniable weight of history. Brandon Carter looked on in horror as his humiliation project transformed into a legendary homecoming. He had invited a cleaning lady of the flames to mock her poverty, but he had accidentally invited the daughter of a savior to a room full of people who owed their lives to her lineage. This story is far from over, and the fire is just beginning to spread through the halls of the elite. If you re-feeling the strength of Sandra's journey and the power of a legacy that never dies, I'd love to have you as part of our community. Why not hit that subscribe button and join us? It's the best way to make sure you never miss a moment of these stories of justice and redemption. Also, I am curious, what do you think is the most important quality in a true leader? Is it the power they hold or the lives they protect? Drop your thoughts in the comments below. The atmosphere in the grand ballroom had shifted from the frigid air of judgment to a heavy, reverent heat that Brandon Carter could no longer control. Elizabeth Jones' hand remained on Sandra Thomas' arm, a physical anchor that signaled to everyone in the room that the power dynamic had fundamentally shifted. Brandon Carter, realizing his social capital was evaporating like water on a hot griddle, attempted one final, desperate maneuver to reclaim his narrative. He stepped toward the podium where the evening's charity auction was set to begin, his face a mask of forced, twitching joviality. He cleared his throat, the sound amplified by the house speakers, cutting through the murmurs of the stunned guests. He put up a lot for auction that was UNN on the program, a $10,000 donation to a local firehouse, but with a twist, the winner would get to have the honored guest. Captain Thomas served as their personal driver for a week. The room went silent, a collective intake of breath at the sheer, unadulterated malice of the suggestion. It was a blatant attempt to put Sandra Thomas back into a position of servitude, to remind her that in his world, everything and everyone had a price tag. Before the auctioneer could even raise his gavel, the silence was shattered by a voice that didn't come from the podium, but from the center of the room. Sandra Thomas didn't wait for someone to defend her. She stepped into the light of the main floor, her charcoal silk dress shimmering like armor. She looked at Brandon Carter, her gaze so steady and devoid of fear that he actually fumbled with the microphone. Sandra Thomas spoke without amplification, yet her voice, honed by years of commanding chaotic firegrounds, filled every corner of the hall. She told the room that heroism isn't a commodity to be auctioned, and that the $10,000 Brandon Carter was offering would uneven cover the cost of the thermal imaging cameras her station desperately needed because his company had spent the last 5 years lobbying for tax breaks that gutted the municipal budget. She looked at the elite of the city and told them that while they sat in rooms of marble and gold, people like her father, Patrick Phillips, were out in the dark, breathing in the poison of their neglect to make sure their towers didn't become their tombs. The raw, unfiltered honesty of her words stripped away the gala's pretension, leaving the wealthy guests looking at their own reflections in the polished floor with a sudden, piercing clarity. The resolution came with the force of a tidal wave when Elizabeth Jones stood up, her presence commanding an immediate hush. She didn't look at Brandon Carter. She looked at Sandra Thomas with a maternal pride that surpassed the 29 years of silence between their families. Elizabeth Jones announced that she was canceling her planned donation to the arts and was instead establishing the Patrick Phillips Foundation with an initial endowment of $25 million. The foundation would be dedicated to providing state-of-the-art equipment and mental health support for every firehouse in the city, and she named Sandra Thomas as the chair of the board. The room erupted into a standing ovation that lasted for several minutes, a thunderous sound that drowned out Brandon Carter's weak attempts to join in. He was a man who had tried to play with fire for his own amusement, only to realize he was standing in a furnace of his own making. By the time the applause died down, Brandon Carter was gone, slipping out of the side exit as his board members began to discuss how to distance the company from his toxic leadership. He had invited a commoner to humiliate her, but he had ended up being the only person in the room who truly lost his dignity. As the gala drew to a close, Sandra Thomas stood on the balcony of the plaza, the cool night air of the city she protected brushing against her face. She looked down at the mechanical watch on her wrist, its steady, rhythmic ticking, a heartbeat shared with the man who had taught her that honor is something you carry, not something you wear. She realized that the goddess the people saw tonight was not a product of the silk dress or the professional makeup. It was the manifestation of a fire that had been burning inside her since she was a little girl, watching her father pull on his boots. She had walked into the lion's den and come out not just unscathed, but as the master of the house. The lesson learned that night wasn't just for the billionaires in the ballroom. It was for Sandra Thomas herself. She understood now that her value was undefined by the soot on her face or the modest balance in her bank account, but by the lives she touched and the legacy of service that no amount of gold leaf could ever truly replicate. She was a firefighter, a captain, and a daughter of a hero. And from that night forward, the city would never look at a siren the same way again. 2 years after the Fotitical Gala, Sandra Thomas had fully embraced her new role. She had met Kenneth Lee, a passionate lawyer for labor rights, at a conference for public safety. Their connection was instant, built on shared values and a deep respect for the working class. Kenneth Lee had stood by her as she managed the foundation and continued her work as a captain. At a subsequent benefit gala organized by Sandra Thomas herself, she saw Karen Gonzalez, a young nurse, receiving a scholarship to further her medical training. Karen Gonzalez looked at Sandra Thomas with stars in her eyes, seeing the same goddess the city had celebrated years ago. Sandra Thomas simply smiled, knowing that the fire she started that night was now lighting the way for thousands of others. Thank you so much for joining us for this incredible story of resilience and truth. We hope that Sandra's journey has inspired you to recognize the goddess within yourself, no matter what uniform you wear. If you're moved by these stories of heroes and their hidden legacies, we'd love to have you officially join our family. Please take a moment to subscribe to the channel. It's a warm and welcoming community where we celebrate the power of character over wealth. We'd also love to know more about you. Please drop a comment letting us know which city you're watching from tonight. Did you enjoy the story of Sandra and Patrick Phillips? What did you learn about the true meaning of nobility? We can't wait to hear your voice in the comments.